The factory was a corpse, and I was picking through its ribs. Rust-colored dust, fine as powdered blood, puffed up from the grated floor with every careful step. The air in the main hall of the abandoned Sparrows Point chemical plant was thick enough to chew, a toxic cocktail of ozone from a dying transformer, and the ghostly memory of reagents that hadn't been mixed in 30 years. I felt less like a journalist and more like a combat engineer navigating a minefield. My instructions, delivered through a series of encrypted, single-use message drops, had been precise to the foot. Turn left at the skeletal catwalk. Descend the spiral stairs past the vats like silent tombs. Wait in the heart of the main reactor chamber. My hand instinctively went to the breast pocket of my jacket, feeling the reassuring lump of my digital voice recorder. The button cam wired into my lapel was a cheap piece of spy tech trash, but its tiny lens was my only witness. My real insurance was back in my apartment. An air-gapped laptop loaded with tales, a dead man's switch tied to a cloud server, and a Faraday bag holding my primary phone. I'd learned long ago that in my line of work, digging into the sealed archives and black-budget projects the government pretends don't exist, paranoia is just another word for professionalism. The reactor chamber was a cathedral of decay, a cavernous cylinder of reinforced concrete. Its roof had been peeled open by some long-forgotten explosion, creating a jagged skylight for the cold Baltimore moon. And there, bathed in its pale light, a man sat on a weathered wooden crate. He didn't look up as I approached. He was perfectly still, a stillness that wasn't peaceful but predatory, like a leopard waiting in a tree. He appeared to be in his late 30s, early 40s at most. He wore simple dark trousers and a gray Henley, the kind of clothes that cost a fortune to look so unassuming. His name, the message had said, was Julian Blackwood. "You're punctual, Mr. Holloway," he said, his voice a low baritone that carried in the vast space without an echo. It was a voice layered with an impossible weariness. "I appreciate that." The offer was intriguing, I said, stopping a safe 10 feet away. "Exclusive material that will rewrite the history of clandestine conflicts on American soil." Your words. "They are," he confirmed, finally lifting his head. His eyes were dark, and they didn't just look at me. They seemed to be assessing the weight of my soul. "But what I'm offering you isn't a story. It's a testament and a warning." I toggled the recorder on in my pocket. "I'm listening." "I'm going to tell you everything," Julian said, his gaze unwavering. "The truth about what I am. The truth about our enemies. The truth about a war that has been fought in the shadows of your world for over a century. In return, you will do only one thing. You will publish it. Not now, but upon confirmation of my final death. You will use this story as a weapon to strip my kind and our enemies of the one advantage that has kept us hidden: your ignorance." My reporter's skepticism, a hardened shield I'd spent a decade forging, screamed at me. This was a setup, a delusion, a prank by a rival outlet. "Your kind?" I asked, my tone laced with the cynicism he had to be expecting. "And who exactly would that be?" He smiled, a faint, humorless twitch of his lips. "I could show you fangs. I could move faster than your eye can track. But that's theater. I find biology to be far more persuasive." He gestured to me. "You have a knife." It wasn't a question. "I always carry a small Kershaw folding knife." I hesitated. "It's a simple request," he urged, his voice calm. "Proof." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the echoing silence. My instincts, every primal nerve ending, told me to run, But the journalist in me, the one who chased whispers of shadow governments and alien cover-ups, was hooked. I pulled out the knife, the click of the blade locking into place sounding like a gunshot. "My arm," he said, extending his left forearm. I stepped forward, my own hand trembling slightly. His skin was cool to the touch, unnaturally so. I pressed the tip of the blade against his flesh and drew a shallow 3-inch cut. Dark blood, almost black in the moonlight, welled up instantly. The color was wrong, thick and viscous like crude oil. I saw it, I registered it, but before my brain could fully process the anomaly, it was gone. With a faint hiss, like steam on cold steel, the edges of the wound pulled together, the skin knitting itself back into a seamless, pale, unblemished surface. Not a drop had been spilled. Not a scar remained. I stumbled back, the knife clattering to the concrete floor. My mind reeled, trying to file the impossibility I'd just witnessed into a logical folder. Special effects. Hypnosis. A trick of the light. "It's not magic, Daniel," Julian said, his voice soft but firm, cutting through my panic. "It's a symbiotic retrovirus. It rewrites the host's DNA, hijacking the cellular regeneration process, overriding the natural limitations of human biology. It supercharges the body but demands a terrible price in fuel." I stared at him, the pieces falling into place with a horrifying click. "Vampire," I breathed. He gave a slight solemn nod. "Among other things." He stood up, his movements fluid and economical. "And to understand what's at stake, I won't begin with my own story. I'll begin with a more recent one." He paced slowly. 3 weeks ago, an informant of mine was killed in a New York City safe house. His name was irrelevant. He was a low-level functionary for one of my rivals. The NYPD found what was left of him. The official report, which was immediately classified and kicked upstairs to a joint FBI task force, described the cause of death as an animal attack of unprecedented savagery. The victim was torn limb from limb. The steel-reinforced door to his apartment was ripped from its hinges. The medical examiner noted claw marks that fractured bone and left trace amounts of something they couldn't identify. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes burning with a cold fire. It was the signature of one of the 2 lycanthrope clans, the Werewolves. That murder wasn't just a killing, it was a declaration. It shattered a fragile truce that has held for nearly 70 years. My professional skepticism was a dying ember against the inferno of what I had seen and what he was saying. This wasn't an interview. This was a deposition for a genocide. Julian walked over to an old battery-powered lantern sitting on the floor and switched it off. The chamber plunged into near-total darkness, leaving only the silver spear of moonlight from the broken roof. My eyes struggled to adjust, but his silhouette was perfectly sharp against the dim light. "To understand why they broke the peace now," he said, his voice now seeming to come from the abyss itself, "you must understand how that peace was made, and for that, we must go back to Louisiana, 1873. The year I died for the first time." My world, as Julian's voice filled the cavernous dark, dissolved into the humid, oppressive heat of the past. It was no longer his voice I heard, but his thoughts, his memories laid bare on the operating table of my mind. "I was a ghost long before I became a monster," he began. "Louisiana, 1873. The war had bled the South dry, and I, a former captain in a cause I no longer believed in, had come home to a different kind of defeat. My plantation, Belle Reve, was a husk, its fields fallow, its spirit broken. But that was a trivial loss. The real devastation had come not from cannon fire, but from the fever, the yellow jack, It had taken my wife, Eleanor, and then our 6-year-old son, Thomas, in the summer of 1869. After that, I simply stopped. I sought oblivion in the bottom of a whiskey bottle and the sweet, cloying smoke of laudanum, waiting for my own end. Then Caius Valerius arrived. He came to my door not as a predator, but as a savior. He presented himself as a European investor, a man of immense wealth and impeccable breeding, looking to acquire land during the chaos of Reconstruction. He had the sharp features of a Roman bust, eyes the color of ancient bronze, and a charisma that could soothe a cornered snake. He spoke of my failing plantation not with pity, but with a vision of its potential empire. He saw through my grief-soaked stupor. He saw the ember of will still glowing beneath the ashes of my despair. He didn't speak of immortality at first. He became my confidant, my mentor. We'd sit on the veranda late into the night, the air thick with jasmine and decay, and he would talk. He spoke of history not as something to be read, but as something he had witnessed. He spoke of human frailty, disease, age, sorrow, as a curable condition. "Grief is a prison, Julian," he told me one evening, his voice a mesmerizing cadence. "You rattle the bars, you scream at the walls, but you remain captive. What if I offered you the key? Not to escape the prison, but to tear it down, stone by stone, and build a palace on its ruins." He was offering a cure for the pain of being human, and I was desperate enough to take it. The turning was not a romantic bite on the neck. It was an agonizing clinical procedure. In the dust-filled quiet of my study, he slit his own wrist with a silver letter opener and bled into a crystal glass. The blood was dark, like the blood I would later see from my own veins. "This is the catalyst," he said, "the retrovirus. It will rewrite you. Drink it and be reborn." The moment the blood touched my tongue, the agony began. It felt like swallowing liquid fire that instantly turned to ice in my veins. My body convulsed, every muscle seizing. For 3 days and nights I lay on a cot in a shuttered room, lost in a fever that felt like I was being simultaneously burned alive and flash-frozen. My bones felt as if they were breaking and resetting, my sinews stretching and reknitting. It was the sound of my own biology being violently dismantled and reassembled at a cellular level. The most profound change was the loss of warmth. The ambient heat of the world, the comfort of a fire, the warmth of another person's skin. It all vanished, replaced by a permanent internal chill. The world became a landscape of varying degrees of cold. When the fever finally broke, I was other. Caius was there, a cloth and a basin of cool water in his hand. "Welcome back," he said simply. My senses were a riot. I could hear the frantic heartbeat of a mouse scrabbling inside the wall 30 feet away. I could see every dust mote dancing in the sliver of light under the door. I could smell the subtle decay of the wood in the floorboards, the faint trace of Eleanor's perfume on a shawl I'd kept in a chest. It was overwhelming, a torrent of information that threatened to drown me. And then there was the hunger. It wasn't a simple craving. It was a gnawing, hollow void in the pit of my being, a primal, all-consuming command that screamed for release. It eclipsed every other thought, every other feeling. My grief for my family, once the sun around which my world orbited, was now a distant, cold star. Caius taught me to master this new reality. "The hunger is not your master," he instructed, his voice a whip of command. "It is a tool, a weapon. You will learn to hone it, to control it, to aim it. A wild beast starves or is killed. A true predator chooses when and where to hunt." For weeks he brought me animals, teaching me to drink without frenzy, to take only what I needed. It was a humiliating base existence, but it was a necessary first step. He was recalibrating me from a man into a weapon. My first true hunt was not some random traveler on a lonely road. That would have been artless. Caius was all about artifice and purpose. The target was the local parish sheriff, a man named Boudreau, who had started asking questions about the foreign gentleman buying up so much property, about the strange lights seen at Belle Reve at all hours of the night. He was a minor, inconvenient complication. We cornered him on the old Bayou Road. He was a large man, confident, but the sight of us emerging from the cypress shadows, our movements too fast, too silent, filled his eyes with a primal terror that I could smell, a sharp, coppery spike in the air. He fumbled for his Colt, but Caius was on him in a blur, a whisper of movement. He didn't kill him. He held him, immobilized, his hand clamped around the sheriff's throat. "Your turn, my son," Caius said, his bronze eyes gleaming. He pushed the terrified, wheezing man towards me. "Show me you have learned the lesson." I looked at Boudreau, at the raw fear in his eyes, and I felt nothing, no pity, no remorse, only the cold, clean logic of the void inside me. He was a threat. He needed to be removed. My human emotions, the grief, the love, the guilt, were now like flowers pressed between the pages of a book I had long since finished reading. They were preserved, but they had no life, no scent. I stepped forward. Caius watched, his expression that of a master artisan judging his creation. "Power, Julian," he murmured, as if reciting a creed. "True power is not wealth or land. It is the right to decide who is worthy of life and who is not." The years that followed my first kill bled into one another, a long crimson smear across the face of a rapidly changing America. Julian's voice continued, a low rumble in the dark. Caius and I were phantoms drifting through the burgeoning cities of the Gilded Age. We were chameleons of capital. We'd build fortunes in railroads or steel, manipulating markets with whispers and threats backed by our unnatural abilities, then vanish before our perpetual youth could draw suspicion, leaving behind a wake of financial ruin and a handful of unexplained disappearances that were quickly forgotten in the nation's relentless march of progress. We were apex predators in a human world, untouchable and supreme. Or so we believed. The illusion shattered in the autumn of 1888, in the dense, pine-choked forests of the Montana Territory. We were tracking a different kind of prey, not for sustenance, but for sport. A grizzled old trapper who had boasted in a saloon of finding a silver lode on land, Caius had his eye on. We found him near his camp. His leg caught fast in one of his own bear traps. He was a cornered animal, perfect for a leisurely hunt. We were savoring the moment, hidden in the shadows of the ancient pines, when the forest went silent. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, it all ceased at once. An unnatural stillness fell, thick and heavy. The trapper's panicked breathing was the only sound. Then from the deep woods came a shape. It moved with a speed that startled even me, a blur of gray fur and muscle. It was not a wolf. It was too large, its form vaguely bipedal but hunched, its movements a terrifying fusion of animal grace and brute intelligent force. Before we could react, it was on the trapper. There was a sound of tearing flesh and snapping bone, a single, choked-off scream, and it was over. The creature stood over the mangled remains, its chest heaving. It raised its head, its long snout sniffing the air, and its eyes, glowing with a faint feral phosphorescence, locked directly onto our position in the trees. It knew we were there. Lycanthrope, Caius hissed beside me, his usual aristocratic calm replaced by a cold, sharp-edged tension. The old blood. The creature let out a howl, not the lonely call of a wolf, but a visceral roar of challenge and pure, undiluted hatred. And then it charged. What followed was not a hunt, but a desperate, chaotic brawl. We were faster than any human, stronger than a dozen men. But this thing was our equal. Its claws, thick as daggers, tore through the trunk of a pine tree I used as a shield. Its strength was primal, explosive. A blow from its forearm sent me flying 20 feet, my ribs cracking on impact. They began to knit back together instantly, but the raw power was a shock to my system. Caius engaged it directly, a whirlwind of precise, lethal strikes. But the beast was a force of nature. For every gash he opened in its hide, the flesh would ripple and seal with astonishing speed. Its regenerative ability was a match for our own. More than that, it seemed to anticipate our movements, its animal senses giving it a precognitive edge that our cold, calculated speed couldn't always overcome. It was Caius who discovered their weakness. During a close-quarters exchange, the creature's claws raked across the silver flask Caius carried in his coat. The beast recoiled with a shriek of agony, a sound utterly different from a cry of simple pain. Smoke, acrid and foul, poured from the wounds where its claws had touched the silver-dusted fabric. The flesh sizzled and blackened, refusing to heal. "The silver!" Caius yelled. "It's poison to them." It was our only advantage, but it wasn't enough. Another creature, then a third, emerged from the tree line, drawn by the sound of battle. We were outnumbered. Caius made the decision. "Fall back! To the city!" We fled. For the first time since my rebirth, I felt the cold touch of true fear. I saw my creator, the seemingly invincible Caius, clutching an arm where the lycanthrope's claws, contaminated with silver dust from his flask, had left deep, suppurating wounds that refused to close. The all-powerful predators were now the prey. As we put distance between ourselves and the forest, Caius explained. "They are the primal kin," he said, his voice strained with pain and effort. "They are not men who simply turn into wolves. They are a shamanistic warrior cult, bound by ancient rites to what they call the spirit of the earth. They view us, the undying, as an abomination, a corruption of the natural cycle of life and death, a blight upon their sacred world, and they have sworn to eradicate us. Silver," he explained, "was not merely a metal to them. It was a spiritual anathema, a conduit that severed their connection to their primal power source, burning their flesh and soul like acid. This encounter fundamentally changed me. I had seen our own power mirrored and in some ways surpassed. But more than that, in the furious, righteous glare of those creatures' eyes, I hadn't just seen mindless savagery. I'd seen conviction. I, who had become a monster to escape human feeling, was now confronted by a monster that fought with a passion I could no longer comprehend. It planted a seed of doubt in the cold, sterile soil of my soul, a question that would haunt me for the next century. Were we the masters of creation, or just its most sophisticated disease? I looked back at the receding tree line, at the vast, dark wilderness that had nearly consumed us. Caius's words echoed in my mind. "We fled to the cities," he told me now, his voice a ghost in the Baltimore factory. "We sought refuge in steel and concrete, believing the modern world would shield us from the wild. We were wrong. We had only traded one forest for another. and this new one was home to a very different breed of wolf. The 1920s roared, and we roared with them, Julian narrated, the scene shifting to the rain-slicked, neon-lit streets of Prohibition-era Chicago. Caius saw the city not as a home, but as a perfectly designed hunting preserve. The Volstead Act had created a shadow economy of speakeasies, bootlegging and gang warfare, a world teeming with corruption, ambition, and violence. It was an ideal ecosystem for predators like us. We didn't align with any one outfit. O'Banion, Capone, it didn't matter. We played them all. Our abilities made us the ultimate spies and enforcers. I could stand in a crowded room and isolate a whispered conversation from across the floor. Caius could walk into a meeting with a rival gangster, and his sheer presence, the ancient authority in his eyes, would be enough to cow the most hardened killer. We carved out a niche, controlling information, influencing turf wars, and feeding on the periphery, our victims dismissed as casualties of the ongoing gang violence. The city was our abattoir. Then our operations started to fail. A shipment of untaxed liquor we were using to leverage a politician would be intercepted by federal agents acting on an anonymous tip. A trusted informant of ours, a clerk in the mayor's office, would vanish without a trace. A hidden cache of cash in a bank's vault was emptied, the vault itself untouched. The only clue, a faint dog-like scent left in the air. These were not the clumsy moves of a rival mob. The precision was surgical. The planning was meticulous. It was Caius who identified the enemy. "They're here," he said one night, standing at the window of our penthouse suite overlooking the city. "A different strain. The wolves have come to the city." This was not the primal kin. This was a new clan, one that had evolved alongside the metropolis. We came to know them as the Concrete Pack. Their lycanthropy wasn't a spiritual pact. It was a genetic trait, passed down through generations, a tightly knit bloodline that had adapted to urban survival. They were not mystics fighting for Mother Earth. They were pragmatists, tacticians, and rivals. They viewed Chicago as their territory, their pack's den, and we were an invasive species competing for the same resources, control, influence, and the choicest human prey. Their methods were terrifyingly modern. They didn't engage in frontal assaults. They waged urban guerrilla warfare. A car bomb would detonate outside one of our front businesses, the shrapnel laced with silver dust. A sniper with a custom-milled silver bullet would take a shot at me as I crossed a bridge, forcing me to dive into the icy Chicago River. They cultivated assets within the Chicago PD and the city administration, turning the very systems we manipulated against us. They were organized, disciplined, and they knew our weaknesses as well as we knew theirs. Caius, enraged at this challenge to his authority, tasked me with finding their leader. "Rip the head from the snake, Julian," he commanded. "Find their alpha. I want his human name. I want his home. I want his family." It became a deadly game of chess played across the city's grid. I became a detective, a hunter of hunters. I stopped feeding at random and began to study them. I analyzed the patterns of their attacks, traced the flow of money from their front operations, laundromats, trucking companies, union halls. I spent my nights perched on gargoyles and rooftops, my enhanced senses straining to catch a familiar scent, a whispered word, a glimpse of someone moving just a little too fast, a little too confidently through the shadows. For the first time in decades, I wasn't just a predator driven by hunger. I was an investigator driven by a puzzle. There was an intellectual thrill to it, a cold, sharp excitement that both exhilarated and frightened me. It was a reminder of the man I once was, twisted into the service of the monster I had become. My breakthrough came after weeks of painstaking work. I managed to track one of their key lieutenants, a man they called Fist, to his human identity. His name was Marcus Gallo. He was a foreman at the Union Stockyards, the city's sprawling slaughterhouse district, the perfect cover, a place where the scent of blood was a constant, masking their own. One frigid November night, I followed him home. He lived in a modest, two-story bungalow in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. This was it. This was the opening Caius demanded. I found a perch in a large oak tree across the street, my body hidden in the tangle of bare branches, and waited for the opportune moment to strike, to gather the final intelligence Caius needed before we moved to annihilate him. The house was warm, lights glowing in the windows against the cold. I focused on the front room, my vision piercing the gloom. Marcus was there, but he wasn't the monster I had been hunting. He was on the floor, on his hands and knees, and on his back, laughing, was a small boy, no older than 5, with a mop of dark, curly hair, pulling on his father's ears and shouting, "Giddy up, horsey." Marcus, the ruthless guerrilla warrior, the beast of the concrete jungle, was pretending to be a horse for his son. He bucked gently, and the boy squealed with delight, his laughter echoing in the quiet street. And I, Julian Blackwood, the soulless predator, the killer of sheriffs and kingpins, simply watched. The cold, logical imperative to act, to finish the mission, evaporated. In that moment, watching a father and his son, the ghost of my own boy, Thomas, rose from the deep, frozen abyss of my memory. For the first time in 50 years, the ice around my heart didn't just crack. It splintered. My hesitation was a fatal error in the cold calculus of Caius's world. Julian's voice turned grim, the memory laced with a new kind of pain. When I returned that night without the information he demanded, without a plan to eradicate Marcus Gallo and his family, he was not merely angry. He was incandescent with a chilling, quiet rage. I tried to explain what I saw, the image of the father and son, the flicker of a forgotten humanity. It was the worst thing I could have said. Humanity? Caius's voice was silk-wrapped steel. He stood before the fireplace, the flames dancing in his ancient bronze eyes. That is not humanity, Julian. That is a weakness, a flaw in the design, an emotional vulnerability that he would use to destroy us without a second thought. I thought I had burned it out of you. Clearly, I was mistaken. His punishment was not a physical blow. It was something far more cruel, a lesson designed to cauterize the wound of my sentimentality forever. "If you are too compromised to be my right hand," he declared, "then I will forge a new one unburdened by the ghosts of a mortal life." His project was a boy named Leo, a 14-year-old newspaper boy, sharp-witted, scrappy, and utterly alone, a piece of driftwood in the harsh currents of the city. He was an orphan who slept in alleys and fought for every scrap. He reminded me of myself, in a way, that same desperate will to survive. He admired me, saw me as the wealthy, powerful figure I projected. I'd sometimes buy all his papers with a $50 bill and tell him to keep the change. I thought it was a kindness. For Caius, it was an opportunity. Caius brought the boy to our penthouse, promising him a life of luxury, a place to belong. He offered him the same gilded poison he had offered me. But the transformation of a child is a perversion of nature far greater than that of a man. Leo's body was locked in the perpetual state of adolescence, a boy of 14 for eternity. But his mind, his instincts, were force-aged by the virus into those of a centuries-old predator. He was a living, breathing paradox of innocence and ancient malice. The new abilities delighted him. The speed, the strength. It was a game. He lacked the adult framework of morality or consequence to temper the savage hunger that now defined him. He became Caius's perfect weapon. His youthful, disarming appearance allowed him to get close to targets in a way I never could. He was a lamb with the soul of a wolf, but his psyche was fracturing under the strain. He would swing from cold, efficient killing to fits of childish rage, smashing furniture and screaming in a high-pitched wail of frustration. He was an immortal trapped in the emotional turmoil of puberty, a psychological catastrophe of Caius's own making. He was a tragedy I had unwittingly helped set in motion. The breaking point came a month later. The war with the concrete pack had escalated. Caius, his patience gone, decided to end my failure. "Leo will finish the job you could not," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "He will remove the Gallo problem, permanently." I protested. I argued. But it was useless. My bond with Caius, the psychological imprint of creator on creation, was too strong. I was paralyzed by his will. He sent Leo to the bungalow in the working-class neighborhood. Leo did not fail. He approached the house in the afternoon, a lost boy asking for a drink of water. Marcus's wife, seeing only a child, let him in. He killed her first. Then he waited. When Marcus came home from the stockyards, he found Leo playing with his son's wooden soldiers on the living room floor, his wife's body in the kitchen. In his grief and rage, Marcus transformed, and Leo, with his small size and unnatural speed, was waiting for it. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. He killed Marcus, and then he killed the boy. When Caius told me, he described it with a surgeon's detachment as a successful operation. For me, it was the final, unforgivable sin. The image of that laughing child, dead at the hands of another child I had inadvertently led to this life, shattered the last chains of my loyalty. The guilt was a physical thing, a white-hot brand on my soul. In creating Leo, Caius hadn't forged a new son. He had created a monster to punish the old one. I saw myself in Leo, a tool, a weapon, nothing more. My tragedy was his, magnified and distorted through the lens of his stolen childhood. That night, I confronted Caius. But it was Leo who met me in the grand foyer. His eyes, once bright with street-smart curiosity, were now cold and empty, reflecting only his loyalty to his new father. "Caius said you've gone soft, Julian," Leo said, his voice a strange mix of adolescent treble and predatory certainty. "He said you're broken." "He broke you, Leo," I pleaded, trying to reach the boy inside the monster. "This isn't you." "This is exactly me," he snarled, and he attacked. He was a whirlwind of fury, all instinct and no finesse. Our fight was brutal and destructive, shattering priceless antiques and tearing through the opulent decor of the penthouse. The sound of our battle, the unholy shrieks and thunderous impacts, echoed through the building, a dinner bell for every supernatural entity in Chicago. We had drawn the attention of the entire concrete pack, who were now surely converging on our location, hungry for vengeance. I finally managed to disarm him, to pin him to the floor. He was just a boy, a horribly strong, impossibly fast boy, but still just a boy. In his eyes, I saw a flicker of fear and confusion. I couldn't kill him, but I couldn't leave him with Caius. As the sounds of sirens and something far more feral grew closer from the streets below, I made a choice. I hauled the weakened, struggling Leo to his feet and smashed through a plate glass window, leaping onto the adjacent rooftop. With my broken brother in my arms, I fled into the night, a traitor to my creator, a murderer to the wolves, an enemy to everyone. The 1930s were a good time to be invisible. Julian's account continued, the backdrop shifting to the stark, monochrome world of the Great Depression. America was a nation of ghosts. Dust Bowl refugees, unemployed factory workers, hobos riding the rails. The country was awash with the desperate and the forgotten. For two fugitives like Leo and me, it was the perfect camouflage. We were hunted. Caius, his pride wounded and his authority challenged, unleashed his loyalists, other vampires of his bloodline, to bring us back. The Concrete Pack, led by a new, vengeful alpha, put a bounty on our heads, their patrols scouring the cities. And out in the wild territories, the primal kin could sense our unnatural presence, their packs howling for our corrupted blood. We were caught in a continental crossfire. Survival became a grim science. I taught Leo the art of being a phantom. We learned to move with the transient populations, sleeping in shanty towns and abandoned farmhouses. We mastered the craft of leaving no trace, creating false trails, laying down scent markers of animals to confuse the lycanthropes, never staying in one place for more than a day. Hunting became a desperate, precise act. No more games, no more sport. We targeted the isolated and the terminally ill, those whose passing would go unnoticed or be attributed to the harshness of the times. It was a bleak, hand-to-mouth existence. This nomadic life corroded what was left of Leo's stability. Ripped away from the structure and perverse praise of Caius, he grew more erratic. The hunger in him was a wild, untamed thing. His control, always tenuous, began to fray completely. He started taking risks, becoming sloppy. He'd kill not for sustenance, but out of a sudden, explosive rage or a chilling, childlike curiosity. A farmer who looked at him the wrong way, a transient who wouldn't share his campfire. These small provocations could end in a flurry of horrific violence that put both of us at risk. I was constantly putting out fires, cleaning up his messes, dragging him away from the scenes of his impulsive carnage. He was my ward, my responsibility, my sin made manifest. The guilt was a physical weight, a constant companion in our flight. I had to manage the logistics of our immortality on the run. We needed new identities, which I created by scouring old county records for birth certificates of infants who had died in pandemics, purchasing their names and histories to build new lives on the bones of the dead. We needed secure, light-proof shelters, which meant breaking into mausoleums or digging crude burrows in the earth like animals. And we needed blood that wasn't tainted by the syphilis, tuberculosis, or malnutrition rampant in the populace. Every feeding was a gamble. Our luck ran out in a ghost town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. It was a former coal mining town, abandoned after the seam ran dry, a perfect place to lie low for a week. We were taking shelter in the old mine foreman's office when they found us. It was the Concrete Pack, a full team of them, at least 5, led by a hardened hunter I recognized from my Chicago days. It was Marcus's second-in-command, a grim-faced lycanthrope who now wore the mantle of Alpha. They had tracked us for months, their pursuit relentless. They didn't storm the building. They were smarter than that. They surrounded us, their movements silent and coordinated. The first sign of their presence was a silver-jacketed bullet punching through the wall and shattering the petrified inkwell on the desk beside my head. We fled into the mine. It was a desperate gambit. The narrow, claustrophobic tunnels would neutralize their numbers and our speed. It became a terrifying game of cat and mouse in the absolute darkness. We could see, but they could smell us, their senses just as acute in the subterranean black. The air was filled with the scrape of their claws on rock and the low, guttural growls that echoed through the shafts. The fight, when it came, was brutal and close quarters. In the confines of a collapsed tunnel, we were a whirlwind of violence. I moved to protect Leo, to shield him, but I also saw the monster he had become. He fought with a gleeful, terrifying savagery, his high-pitched laugh echoing sickeningly as his claws tore through the flesh of one of the wolves. In that moment, I was torn between a brother's protective duty and a deep, visceral revulsion. We fought them to a standstill. Their leader, the new Alpha, was a veteran. He fought with cold, calculated fury, his claws tipped with silver dust. He managed to land a glancing blow across Leo's chest, a deep, vicious rake that sent my brother stumbling back with a scream of pure agony. That scream gave us our chance. The emotional shockwave of his pain seemed to disorient the pack for a split second. It was enough. I grabbed Leo and plunged deeper into the mine's labyrinthine depths, eventually finding an old ventilation shaft that led to the surface on the far side of the mountain. We had escaped, but we were not safe. Leo's wounds were the real problem. Normally, a cut would heal in seconds, but this was a silver wound. The flesh around the gashes was blackened and necrotic. A foul-smelling dark fluid wept from the cuts. They weren't healing. The symbiotic retrovirus in his underdeveloped system was unstable. It couldn't properly execute the repair protocols against the overwhelming toxic shock of the silver. His body was failing. He was weakening, shivering with a fever that our kind was never meant to experience. He was dying, slowly and in agony. I knew Caius would have the knowledge to save him, but returning to our Creator was a death sentence. To save the brother I had stolen, to atone for the monster I had helped create, I needed a cure. And in that desperate moment, I knew there was only one other group that understood the poison of silver as intimately as we did. I needed a new ally, even the most unthinkable one. The world had changed again by the time we limped into Los Angeles in the late 1940s, Julian said, his voice now carrying the weight of a desperate strategist. The Second World War was over, but a new, colder war was beginning. The air was thick with paranoia, whispers of spies and communists, and the nascent tendrils of what would become the CIA were starting to take root. In this new landscape of secrets and surveillance, being a fugitive was becoming exponentially harder. Caius, I knew, would thrive in such an environment, turning the tools of national security to his own ends. Leo was fading, the silver poisoning eating away at him from the inside. We couldn't keep running. I made a decision born of absolute desperation. I would do the one thing no vampire in history had ever done willingly. I would seek a truce with the wolves. It was an insane gamble. I was proposing an alliance with the very people who had vowed to destroy us, whose leader I had indirectly caused the death of. But they were the only ones whose healers might know how to counteract the silver's lingering poison. And I had one card to play, one piece of bait I hoped was valuable enough to buy our lives. Caius. Getting a message to them was a delicate and dangerous operation. I used the criminal underworld as a go-between, leaving a coded message with a bookie known to have ties to the Concrete Pack's West Coast operations. The message was simple. The enemy of my enemy. I have the keys to the kingdom. Mount Wilson Observatory. New Moon. Come alone. I was counting on one thing. That their hatred for Caius, the architect of their Alpha's demise, was greater than their hatred for me. The meeting took place under the cold, silent dome of the 100-inch Hooker telescope. The air in the observatory was thin and sharp. I stood alone in the center of the vast, dark chamber, the colossal telescope looming over me like the skeleton of a god. I had Leo hidden and sedated miles away. This was a meeting I had to take alone. He didn't come alone, of course. I could hear the heartbeats of at least 4 others, hidden in the shadows of the gallery above. But the one who stepped into the circle of moonlight on the floor was the man I had hoped for, and the man I had feared. It was Marcus Gallo. He hadn't died in Chicago. He had survived. His face was a roadmap of scars, a testament to the life he had led since that night. But the deepest scars were in his eyes. They were filled with a cold, weary grief and a bottomless well of hatred directed entirely at me. "Holloway," he growled, his voice a low rumble. He still thought of me by the alias I had used in Chicago. "You have a lot of nerve." "I'm not here for forgiveness, Marcus," I said, my voice steady. "I'm here to offer you justice." The atmosphere was thick with a millennium of instinctual animosity. He saw a leech. I saw a rabid dog. But we were both businessmen in our own way. I laid out my offer. I would give them everything they needed to dismantle Caius's entire empire. His network of human agents, his financial assets hidden in Swiss banks and shell corporations, his daylight sanctuaries, his emergency protocols. And most importantly, I offered them proof, financial records, correspondence, that Caius had been secretly manipulating not just the authorities, but the primal kin as well, feeding them information to instigate conflicts with the concrete pack, weakening both his lycanthrope enemies in a long, patient war of attrition. I gave him a taste, a sign of good faith. "Check the accounts of a Delaware LLC called Valerius Holdings," I told him. "Yesterday it transferred $2 million to a conservation group in Wyoming. That group is a front for the primal kin. That money is for silver weapons, weapons they will use on you." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not trust, but calculation. He knew I was telling the truth, the enemy of his enemy. "In exchange for this, betrayal of your own kind?" he asked, the word betrayal dripping with contempt. "Sanctuary," I said. "A territory declared neutral, for myself and for Leo, and the help of your healers. I can't stop the Silver's progression. You can." Marcus stared at me for a long time, the silence stretching thin. He was weighing a century of war against the chance to decapitate the vampire who had taken his family. He remembered my sparing him that night, but he also couldn't forget the massacre that followed. I was a paradox he couldn't solve. "Caius is the true enemy," I pressed. "He creates monsters like me, like Leo. Help me stop him, and you stop the disease at its source." Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. The pragmatist had won. "We have a deal," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "We will help your brother. We will hunt Caius with you. We will give you a sanctuary." A wave of relief, cold and unfamiliar, washed over me. It was short-lived. "But there are conditions," Marcus added, his eyes hardening. "Your information must be perfect. Any deviation, any hint of a double cross, and we will tear you apart. And the second condition—" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The boy, Leo, he stays with us. He will be our guest and our collateral. He is the guarantee that you will hold up your end of the bargain." The choice was a vice closing around my heart. To save Leo, I had to hand him over to his mortal enemies. To leave my broken, unstable brother in the care of wolves. It was an impossible choice, and yet it was the only one I had. Agreed, I said, the word tasting like ash. My war against Caius had just gained a powerful new army, but I had just traded my only family as the price of admission. Our alliance was a thing of terrifying efficiency. Julian's voice was taut, the memory of the battle still sharp after all these years. It was the mid-1950s. We planned the assault for weeks, a joint operation combining my insider knowledge with the pack's tactical prowess. Our target was Caius's Citadel, a sprawling fortified Spanish Revival mansion nestled in the hills of Beverly Hills, a fortress disguised as old Hollywood luxury. I was the ghost in their machine, the asset that made the impossible possible. I guided them through the layers of Caius's defenses, the pressure plates, the infrared sensors, the loyal human staff trained to kill. The concrete pack, led by Marcus, provided the muscle. They were a modern commando unit. In their human forms, they were armed with suppressed submachine guns loaded with silver-jacketed hollow points. In their transformed state, they were living siege engines. But Caius was no fool. He was an ancient strategist who felt the tendrils of my betrayal long before we made our move. He had made his own unholy alliance. He reached out to the primal kin, feeding them a twisted narrative. That the city wolves had corrupted a vampire. That our pact was a blasphemy against nature itself. A final perversion that must be purged with fire and claw. He offered them the location of our staging ground and the time of our attack. The night of the assault, a night we would later call the Night of Long Fangs, the hills of Los Angeles became a three-sided slaughterhouse. As our teams moved on the mansion, the primal kin erupted from the canyons and chaparral, attacking the perimeter. They were a force of pure chaos, a wave of fur and fury that crashed against the concrete pack's disciplined lines. They didn't distinguish between city wolf and vampire. To them, it was all part of the same urban blight. Inside, the battle was a surreal ballet of violence. My alliance with Marcus's team was seamless. We moved through the marble halls and opulent rooms like a single organism. His wolves, in human form, would lay down suppressing fire, the zip and crack of their silver rounds tearing through Caius's vampire guards. I would move through the chaos, a blur of motion, dispatching sentries with silent, precise strikes, disabling the traps I had helped design years ago. For a brief, terrifying moment, we were not vampire and werewolf. We were soldiers. We fought our way to the mansion's grand library, Caius's inner sanctum. And there, standing before the massive, unlit fireplace, he was waiting for us. But he was not alone. Beside him stood Leo. The pack's healers had not been able to cure him. They had only managed to stabilize the silver poisoning, to halt its advance. He was weak, his face pale and drawn, but the sight of his creator, of Caius, reignited the twisted loyalty that had been burned into his very being. The imprinting of a sire on his child is a powerful, almost unbreakable psychological chain. "Julian," Leo whispered, his eyes wide with confusion and a terrible, familiar adoration for the monster before him. "You came back." "He did not come back for you, my son," Caius said smoothly, placing a proprietary hand on Leo's shoulder. "He came with them, with the dogs who murdered your new family." He had twisted the narrative. He had told Leo that the pack had killed the healers who were caring for him. A lie, but a potent one. Seeing Marcus and his wolves enter the room behind me, Leo's face contorted in a mask of rage and betrayal. He snarled, a sound of pure animal fury, and launched himself not at me, but at Marcus. This was the moment Caius had engineered, the ultimate test of my allegiance, My new ally, the man to whom I had given my word, was about to be torn apart by the brother I had sworn to protect. It was a checkmate of the soul. Marcus was strong, but Leo, even weakened, was a dervish of vampiric speed and strength. He drove Marcus back, claws flashing. In that split second, I saw the truth with horrifying clarity. Leo could not be saved. He was not a boy anymore. He was a vessel of pure, unending suffering, a weapon that would always point back at its own heart. My quest to save him had been a selfish act of atonement, a fool's errand from the start. To protect the future, I had to let go of the past. I moved. I threw myself between Leo and Marcus, catching my brother's attack on my forearms, the impact shuddering through my entire frame. I held him there, his wild eyes boring into mine. "I'm sorry, Leo," I whispered. The heavy oak doors of the library slammed shut. Caius stood before them, a chillingly serene smile on his face. He surveyed the scene, me restraining his crazed progeny, Marcus recovering his footing, the surviving wolves holding their positions. "A perfect family portrait," Caius purred, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "The traitor, the monster, and the wolf. How very dramatic. Now I believe it is time to end this little play." He took a step forward, his ancient power radiating from him like a palpable cold, and the true final battle began. The final battle was not a battle. It was a reckoning. Julian's voice was low, heavy with the finality of that night. Caius unleashed his full power. He was a primordial force, ancient and absolute. The air grew heavy, charged with his malevolent will. He moved, and he was no longer just a man, but a blur of violence, a living embodiment of his own dark creed. He swatted Marcus aside like a fly, sending the powerful lycanthrope crashing through a massive mahogany table. He turned on me, and his speed was something I had never truly witnessed. A strike, too fast to see, caught me in the chest, and I felt my ribs splinter and my sternum crack. I was thrown across the room, my body a broken puppet. The retrovirus in my blood immediately went to work, the agonizing sensation of bones knitting and flesh reweaving, but it was slow, too slow. Caius strode toward me, his face a mask of cold disappointment. "I gave you eternity, Julian. I gave you power beyond imagining, and you threw it away for sentiment, for a ghost. You are my greatest failure." He raised his hand, the fingers curled into a claw ready to deliver the final killing blow. And in that moment something broke in Leo. Through the fog of his madness, through the layers of brainwashing and pain, a flicker of the boy he once was. The boy who had admired me, the only person who had ever shown him a shred of kindness, surfaced. He saw his creator about to annihilate the one person who had tried to save him. And he made a choice. With a raw, agonized scream that was both child and beast, Leo launched himself at Caius. It was not an attack. It was a sacrifice. He threw his arms around Caius's waist, sinking his fangs into his creator's shoulder, a futile, desperate act of defiance. For a precious few seconds, Caius was distracted. He looked down at Leo, clinging to him like a burr, with an expression of utter shock and disgust. "Ingrate!" he hissed. It was the opening Marcus and I needed. As Caius, in his rage, drove his hand straight through Leo's chest, Marcus, who had recovered, hurled something across the floor to me. It skidded across the polished wood, stopping inches from my hand. It was a heavy, ornate piece of broken silver, the base of a candelabra from a shattered side table. While Caius was still entangled with my dying brother, I surged to my feet, grabbing the jagged piece of silver. All the pain, all the guilt, all the centuries of servitude fueled me. I closed the distance in a single, desperate bound and drove the silver shard with all my strength into Caius's heart. There was no scream, only a look of profound, ultimate surprise on his ancient face. He looked down at the silver buried in his chest, then up at me, and then the change began. He did not turn to dust. That is a myth. The reality was far more horrific. The retrovirus, its central command node in the heart destroyed, went haywire. It was a biological system in catastrophic failure. His body began to cannibalize itself from the inside out. His skin blackened and cracked, smoke pouring from the fissures. His form convulsed and twisted, desiccating at a terrifying rate, the flesh petrifying, the bones turning to brittle charcoal. Within a minute, the magnificent Caius Valerius was reduced to a blackened, contorted, stone-like mummy, a grotesque monument to his own corrupted science. The power holding the room captive vanished. I stumbled over to Leo. He lay on the floor, the life fading from his young, old eyes. The madness was gone. For the first time in decades, I saw the boy again. He looked up at me, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "Cold," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's so cold, Julian." And then he was still. The boy who was never allowed to grow up had finally found his peace. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the shattered windows, the battle was over. The surviving members of the concrete pack, grim and bloodied, began a silent, efficient retreat, carrying their wounded and their dead. They had a protocol for this, a cleanup that would erase any evidence of the night's battle. The official story would be a tragic fire, a gas leak, a convenient fiction to mask an inconvenient truth. Marcus met my gaze from across the ruined library. He gave a single, solemn nod. Our pact was fulfilled. His vengeance was complete. My debt was paid. Then he too was gone. I was left alone in the wreckage of my former life, with the petrified corpse of my creator and the cooling body of my brother. The war was over. For a time. Julian's narrative faded, the echoes of that bloody dawn receding, leaving me once again in the cold, oppressive darkness of the Baltimore factory. His silence was heavier than any words he had spoken. "I thought that was the end," he said, his voice returning to the present, filled with a weariness that transcended time. "I was a fool. It was just the end of a chapter. And now, the final one is beginning, right here, in this city." The silence that followed Julian's story was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air from the cavernous reactor chamber. My digital recorder, nestled in my pocket, had faithfully captured hours of a monologue that felt less like a history and more like the prologue to an apocalypse. My world had been fundamentally, irrevocably tilted on its axis. Monsters were real, and their wars were fought in the alleys and boardrooms of my reality. "I buried Leo in the hills overlooking the ocean," Julian said, his voice pulling me from my stupor. "I walked away from it all. For decades, I lived in the quiet places of the world, seeking a peace that would never come. But I kept my eyes and ears open." He stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of the exhaustion in his face. It wasn't just age. It was the crushing weight of witnessing too much history, too much death. "Which brings us to now," he continued, "to why I summoned you, Daniel. The informant in New York, the one torn apart. His death wasn't the work of the primal kin or the concrete pack. The forensic signature was wrong. The savagery was there, but it was imprecise, messy. A blend of the primal's brute force and a calculated urban malice. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick manila folder, tossing it at my feet. That is my life's work, the real story. I bent down and picked it up. My hands were shaking. Inside was a meticulously organized collection of documents, redacted police reports from a dozen cities, leaked autopsy files from the NYC Chief Medical Examiner's office detailing anomalous biological markers, satellite photos of clandestine compounds in remote areas, and complex financial transaction logs that all traced back to a single innocuous-looking bioengineering corporation with a Delaware registration, Synthesis Innovations. After Caius's death, his assets were scattered, Julian explained. Most were seized by the pack or lost, but his most valuable possession, his biological research, his notes, the samples of his own blood and the tissue of his enemies, that archive went missing. I thought it was destroyed in the fire. I was wrong, someone recovered it. He paced before me, a caged predator. For the last 20 years, someone has been building on Caius's work, using modern technology, CRISPR, viral vectors, synthetic biology. They have done what he only dreamed of. They have crossbred our species. They have created a third strain of lycanthrope, hybrids, engineered with vampire blood. The full horror of his revelation washed over me. The New York killer was one of them, Julian confirmed. They are stronger and faster than any wolf I have ever faced. They have the cunning of the city pack and the ferocity of the primals. But their most terrifying advantage, the vampire DNA has stabilized their transformation. They are not beholden to the moon. They can partially shift in daylight. They are the perfect soldier for a war fought out of the shadows. He stopped, his dark eyes locking onto mine. Their goal isn't territory or balance. It's extermination. They see the old clans as obsolete, and my kind as genetic donors to be harvested. And humanity. Humanity is just the battlefield. They are a cancer, and they are spreading. This was it. The reason. The purpose of this entire insane night. I wasn't just being given a story. I was being handed a weapon and being told to fire it. "My war is over, Daniel," Julian said, his voice resonating with a profound finality. "I am tired. The fire that drove me for a century is now just embers. But their war is just beginning. I have given you the what, the who, and the why. It's all in that folder. You are a journalist. You know how to dig, how to expose, do it. Unmask Synthesis. Show the world what they are. Give the other factions and humanity itself a fighting chance. It's the only way." I clutched the folder to my chest. This wasn't a scoop. This was a burden of biblical proportions. Publishing this would ignite a global panic, chaos, witch hunts. But silence? Silence meant allowing a covert genocide to proceed unchecked. I was no longer an observer. He had made me a combatant. Suddenly, a sound from outside the factory walls shattered the stillness. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the screech of metal. It was a horrifying fusion of the two. A high-pitched guttural roar that ended in a grating mechanical shriek. Julian's head snapped up, his posture instantly shifting from weary academic to deadly predator. All the exhaustion vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "They're faster than I anticipated," he said, his voice devoid of fear. "They tracked my electronic spoor. They've come for the source of the leak." He looked at me, a final grim instruction in his eyes. "They've come for me." The massive, corrugated steel door at the far end of the reactor chamber groaned, then buckled inward with a deafening shriek of tortured metal. It was ripped from its hinges as if it were cardboard. In the gaping black doorway, several silhouettes appeared. They were man-shaped, but grotesquely so. Too tall, too lean, their limbs held at unnatural angles. and in the darkness of their faces, pairs of eyes ignited with a burning, predatory red glow. "There's a service tunnel behind this reactor," Julian commanded, his voice sharp, giving me no time to be paralyzed by terror. "It leads to the old sewer lines. Run, Daniel. Run and do not look back. Publish it. Make my death mean something." He turned to face the advancing figures, a lone, archaic warrior preparing to meet a new and terrible future. As I scrambled backward into the shadows, clutching the testament of a dying monster, Julian Blackwood charged forward to fight his last battle, buying me time with the only currency he had left: his own damnation.